Have you ever found yourself staring at your phone at 3 in the morning, wondering why someone who seemed to want nothing to do with you suddenly reappears in your life like a ghost materializing through walls? Did you ever notice how these emotionally elusive souls have an uncanny ability to resurface precisely when you've convinced yourself you've moved on? This phenomenon, why avoidants keep coming back when you least expect it, isn't mere coincidence or cruel fate. It's a psychological dance as old as human connection itself, choreographed by invisible forces that govern both the avoidant mind and your own perception of reality. Predictably unpredictable. That's the paradox that haunts every relationship touched by avoidant attachment. You see, there's something deliciously ironic about the human condition. We're pattern-seeking creatures living in a world of apparent randomness, desperately trying to make sense of behaviors that seem to defy logic. When that avoidant partner, friend, or lover vanishes into thin air, only to reappear weeks or months later with a casual text or unexpected phone call, you're not experiencing random chaos. You're witnessing the intricate workings of a psychological defense system that's been millennia in the making. What you'll discover in our time together today isn't just another relationship advice sermon. No, we're going deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the avoidant psyche, where contradictions live comfortably alongside each other, where the desperate need for connection battles eternally with the terror of vulnerability. We'll explore why your mind plays tricks on you through something psychologists call the recency, illusion, and availability heuristic, cognitive biases that make these unexpected returns feel far more significant and frequent than they actually are. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating. Understanding these patterns isn't just about predicting when your avoidant might surface again. It's about recognizing the elaborate theater of approach and withdrawal that keeps both of you trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. The avoidant doesn't return randomly. They return strategically, though they themselves might not consciously realize it. They return when their internal emotional temperature has cooled enough to risk re-engagement, when loneliness outweighs fear, when they've convinced themselves that perhaps this time will be different. Meanwhile, your brain is playing its own tricks on you. Every time they return, your mind stamps that moment as significant, filing it away as evidence of a pattern, making you hyper-vigilant to signs of their next appearance. This creates a feedback loop where you become increasingly sensitive to their presence, while they become increasingly comfortable with their pattern of disappearing and reappearing, knowing, consciously or not, that you'll likely still be there, waiting in the wings. Today we'll unravel this mystery together. You'll learn why avoidants operate on what I call emotional thermostat theory, maintaining just enough distance to feel safe while preserving just enough connection to avoid complete isolation. You'll understand how your own mind conspires against you through cognitive biases that make their sporadic attention feel more meaningful than it might actually be. Most importantly, you'll discover practical strategies for breaking free from this exhausting cycle, whether your goal is to build a healthier dynamic or to finally, definitively, close the door on this chapter of your life. The curtain is rising on one of humanity's most perplexing relationship dynamics. Are you ready to step behind the scenes and see how the magic trick really works? Let me tell you about James and Sarah. Though their names could be any names, their story could be your story. James possessed that particular brand of charm that avoidants often do, intensely present when present, devastatingly absent when absent. For 3 months, he and Sarah built something that felt extraordinary. He would show up at her apartment with her favorite coffee, stay up until dawn discussing everything from quantum physics to childhood dreams, make love with an intensity that felt like drowning and flying simultaneously. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch in his neural circuitry, James began to retreat. The daily texts became weekly. The weekend plans became vague possibilities. The man who once couldn't get enough of Sarah's thoughts and opinions suddenly seemed allergic to anything resembling emotional intimacy. Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, analyzing every interaction, wondering if she had said or done something wrong. But here's the thing about avoidance. Their withdrawal often has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with their own internal alarm system that screams danger whenever connection becomes too real. After 2 months of this maddening dance, James disappeared entirely. No explanation, no argument, no closure, just the deafening silence of an empty phone and unanswered messages. Sarah went through the predictable stages: confusion, anger, bargaining, and eventually something resembling acceptance. She started dating again, threw herself into work, convinced her friends and herself that she was over it. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening 6 months later, as Sarah was laughing with a new romantic interest at a restaurant, her phone buzzed. "Hey, I know this is out of the blue, but I've been thinking about you. How are you?" The message hit her like a lightning bolt. All the carefully constructed defenses crumbled in an instant. The new person across from her suddenly seemed pale and insubstantial compared to the ghost that had just materialized in her palm. This is where the story becomes interesting from a psychological perspective. Sarah's brain, you see, had been playing an elaborate trick on her. Every time James had reappeared in the past, and there had been previous cycles, her mind had catalogued these moments as highly significant events. The quiet months of his absence faded into background noise, while his returns blazed in her memory like fireworks against a night sky. This is the availability heuristic at work. We judge the likelihood and importance of events based on how easily we can remember them, not on their actual frequency or significance. Sarah believed deep in her bones that James always came back. Her mind had created a narrative where his returns were inevitable, meaningful, and somehow cosmically significant. She couldn't see that for every time he had returned, there had been months of absence. She couldn't see that his returns often coincided not with any deep realization about their connection, but with his own cycles of loneliness, rejection by others, or simply boredom. But James's psychology was equally complex. In his mind, Sarah represented safety and danger in equal measure. Safety because she had proven time and again that she would be there when he returned, reliable, forgiving, willing to overlook his patterns of disappearance. Danger because she wanted things from him that felt impossible to give. Consistency, emotional availability, the vulnerability that comes with genuine commitment. So James lived in a perpetual state of approach avoidance conflict. He would retreat until the loneliness became unbearable, then return just long enough to get his emotional needs met before the anxiety of true intimacy sent him running again. He had unconsciously trained himself to view Sarah as an emotional vending machine, always available, always dispensing what he needed, never making demands he couldn't meet. The cruelest part of this dynamic is that both James and Sarah were getting something out of it, even as it caused them both tremendous pain. Sarah got the intermittent reinforcement that psychology tells us is more addictive than consistent reward. The unpredictable hits of connection that kept her hoping for more. James got the comfort of knowing someone cared about him without the terror of having to fully reciprocate that care. When James texted that rainy Thursday, Sarah faced a choice that millions of people in her situation face every day. She could respond, beginning another cycle of hope and inevitable disappointment. Or she could recognize the pattern for what it was. Not romance, not fate, not a cosmic sign that they were meant to be together, but the predictable behavior of someone who had learned that she would always be there when he needed her to be. The tragedy and the beauty of human connection lie in these moments of choice. Sarah's story didn't end with that text message. It began there, because for the first time she saw the pattern clearly. She understood that James's return wasn't about her worth or their connection or any grand romantic narrative. It was about his own internal weather system, and she had been allowing herself to be buffeted by storms that had nothing to do with her. Now, let me share with you the roadmap out of this labyrinth, the practical wisdom that can free you from these exhausting cycles of hope and disappointment. The first principle you must understand is what I call the emotional thermostat theory. Avoidants operate on an internal temperature gauge that's exquisitely sensitive to intimacy. When connection becomes too warm, too real, too vulnerable, their system kicks in to cool things down. They don't consciously decide to withdraw. Their nervous system makes this decision for them, triggering fight or flight responses to emotional closeness that feel, to them, like genuine threats to their survival. Understanding this means recognizing that their withdrawal isn't personal, but it also means accepting that their returns aren't necessarily personal either. They come back when their internal temperature has cooled enough to risk re-engagement, when loneliness outweighs fear, when they've convinced themselves that maybe this time they can handle more intimacy. But unless they've done significant internal work on their attachment patterns, the same cycle will repeat. Your first practical step is to map their pattern. Not obsessively, not as a way to predict and control their behavior, but as a way to see clearly what's actually happening versus what your mind tells you is happening. Write down the dates of their departures and returns. Note the circumstances, the duration of absence, the reasons they gave for returning. You'll likely discover that what felt random and emotionally charged is actually quite predictable and tactical. This mapping exercise serves a crucial purpose. It breaks the spell of the recency illusion. When you see their pattern laid out in black and white, you realize that their returns aren't rare, magical events deserving of your breathless attention. They're simply one part of a predictable cycle that serves their emotional needs while keeping you in a state of perpetual uncertainty. The second step is to implement what I call response choice architecture. This means deciding in advance, and when you're thinking clearly, how you want to respond when they inevitably return. Not if they return, when they return. Because if you're dealing with a true avoidant who has learned that you're a safe harbor in their emotional storms, they will return. Your response choices might include complete no contact, where you don't respond at all; conditional engagement, where you respond but with clear boundaries about what kind of relationship you're willing to have; or conscious closure, where you respond once to clearly communicate that you're no longer available for this dynamic. The key is making this choice when you're not in the emotional storm of their unexpected return. The third principle involves understanding and counteracting the availability heuristic that's been working against you. Your brain has been cataloging their returns as highly significant while letting their absences fade into the background. You need to actively work against this bias by creating what I call absence awareness practices. This might involve setting a daily reminder on your phone that simply says, Day X of living my own life, or keeping a journal that focuses on your experiences and growth independent of their presence or absence. Remember, your brain evolved to pay attention to dramatic, emotionally charged events like unexpected returns from absent lovers. It's not naturally wired to notice the steady accumulation of ordinary days when you're building a life without them. You have to consciously train your attention toward your own experience and away from their sporadic appearances. The fourth step is developing what attachment researchers call earned security. This means learning to provide for yourself the emotional regulation and consistency that you've been seeking from them. When you're securely attached to yourself, their returns become less destabilizing because you're not depending on them to validate your worth or provide emotional stability. This involves creating routines and relationships that ground you in your own life, rather than keeping you perpetually waiting for their next appearance. It means building friendships that don't revolve around analyzing their behavior, pursuing goals that excite you, independent of romantic outcomes, and developing practices, whether meditation, therapy, exercise, creative pursuits, that help you maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of their presence or absence. The fifth principle is perhaps the most challenging: learning to grieve the fantasy relationship while staying present to reality. Part of what makes their returns so powerful is that they briefly resurrect the fantasy of who they could be if only they were different. But loving someone's potential while ignoring their consistent patterns is a recipe for endless suffering. This doesn't mean becoming cynical or closing your heart. It means learning to see people clearly, including their limitations, and making choices based on reality rather than possibility. It means accepting that someone can care about you and still being capable of the kind of relationship you deserve. It means understanding that you can love someone and still choose to protect yourself from their patterns. Finally, you must master the art of emotional non-attachment to outcomes. This doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means learning to engage authentically without needing specific responses to feel okay about yourself. When an avoidant returns and you're truly non-attached to the outcome, you can respond from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. You can be kind without being available, loving without being a doormat, open-hearted without being naive. This level of emotional maturity transforms the entire dynamic. Paradoxically, when you stop being reliably available for their intermittent returns, when you stop providing the safety net that enables their pattern, they either have to evolve their approach or find someone else to play this game with. Either outcome serves your highest good. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the maze of avoidant behavior and the cognitive biases that keep us trapped within it. If you've recognized yourself in Sarah's story, if you've felt the familiar sting of unexpected returns from someone who specializes in disappearing acts, know this: you are not powerless, and you are not doomed to repeat these cycles indefinitely. The pattern of avoidance returning when you least expect it isn't mystical or romantic, it's psychological and predictable. They return when their internal emotional thermostat allows it, when loneliness outweighs fear, when they need emotional regulation, and remember that you've provided it before. Your mind makes these returns feel more significant than they are because of how memory and attention work, not because they represent genuine change or commitment on their part. But here's what I want you to understand above all else. Recognizing these patterns isn't about becoming cynical or closing your heart to love. It's about loving yourself enough to require consistency, to choose relationships that grow rather than cycles that repeat, to understand that real love doesn't require you to accept breadcrumbs or to forever wonder when the next disappearing act will begin. The most profound act of self-love you can commit is to stop being a reliable audience for someone else's avoidance patterns. When you truly internalize that their behavior reflects their internal weather system rather than your worth, when you stop providing a guaranteed soft landing for their periodic returns, you free both yourself and them from a dynamic that serves no one's highest good. Your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is this: map their pattern. See it clearly without the romantic narrative that makes their inconsistency seem meaningful. Decide in advance how you want to respond when they next return, because they likely will. Build a life so rich and fulfilling that their presence becomes an addition to your happiness, not the source of it. Most importantly, remember that someone's inability to love you consistently says nothing about your lovability and everything about their capacity. You deserve someone who doesn't disappear when intimacy gets real, who doesn't need months of absence to appreciate your presence, who doesn't treat your heart like a hotel they can check into and out of at will. The next time your phone buzzes with that familiar name, the one that makes your heart skip and your carefully built defenses crumble, remember this conversation. Remember that you have a choice. Remember that patterns are only powerful as long as you participate in them unconsciously. Break the pattern. Choose yourself. Trust that real love doesn't require you to accept less than you deserve, or to forever wonder when the next disappearing act will begin. The most beautiful relationships in your future are waiting for you to stop settling for the one that keeps you in the past. Your story doesn't end with their return. It begins with your choice of how to respond. Choose wisely. Choose yourself. Choose love that stays.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.